Welcome to Talking with Tatchell. The prison system is not fit for purpose. As we all know, our jails are filled with record numbers of prisoners. Rehabilitation isn't working. More and more reoffenders are coming out of the system. People go in often as minor petty criminals and come out as hardened criminals bent on a life of crime. We also see the issue of prison overcrowding, which is frustrating attempts at rehabilitation. There's another issue, which is the numbers of prisoners who are serving sentences for crimes they did not commit, the failure of the Home Office to tackle miscarriages of justice. With me to discuss the flaws and failings of our prison system and how we might put them right is Juliet Lyon, Director of the Prison Reform Trust. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
I wonder if you could start by just giving us a sense of what are the fundamental flaws and failings of the prison system as it currently operates?
Well, I think you've already covered a lot of ground. We're looking at a prison population which has risen by about 25,000 in the last 15 years, with no appreciable rise in crime to actually justify that. What we're seeing is sentencing has got much tougher, that far more people are going to jail for sentences that maybe 10 or 15 years ago they'd have received a fine or a community penalty. And the sentences themselves have got very much longer. So, you know, there's been, if you like, inflation in sentencing. So that's one of the things that's driving the numbers up. We've mentioned overcrowding. When you look at overcrowding, it's not just the issue about sharing a cell, which is often cramped, often has an unscreened lavatory in it, often, nearly always, you have to eat your meal in that cell, as well as going to the lavatory, as well as sleeping in it. So it's not great conditions, but I appreciate across the world there are worse. But one of the things about overcrowding, of course, is what officials refer to as the churn, and that's the constant movement of prisoners from one prison to another. So no sooner do they begin to get to know people there, they begin to maybe doing a programme or some sort of effort at rehabilitation or resettlement, and they're off again on the bus moving to another prison, because the prisoners on remand have to be held near the court, so anyone's sentence gets moved on and on and on again. So that kind of discontinuity is very, very disruptive at any efforts to reduce reoffending. So reoffending rates are exceptionally high.
Roughly what are they?
Well, the ballpark figure is 2 in 3 people are reconvicted following 2 years release from prison, usually in the first few weeks, but within 2 years we're talking about 2 in 3 people.
How does that compare to other European countries?
Pretty badly, actually, but then we use prison much more as well than most other European countries. But if you look at particular groups, then you have real cause to worry. Look at the petty offenders, they're highly likely to offend again. Look at the 18 to 20-year-olds, and you're seeing a reconviction rate of about 74%. And the under 18s, over 80%. So, you know, almost everybody simply going through the revolving door of prison and offending and back to prison again. So, you know, it's not a system that's working well to keep society safe. It's not going to reduce reoffending, and it's probably, in fact we know, going to increase the stress and strain, not only on staff, but of course on prisoners. And we're looking at now a very high suicide and self-harm rate, which is really disappointing, because one of the things that the Home Office, when it was in charge of prisons, which was up until very recently, was really working hard on safer custody. But this level of overcrowding, I think, has swept some of that good work aside. And already 57 people have died in prison this year.
And those presumably are people who, in many cases, didn't have the appropriate psychiatric assessments, the support?
Well, that's right. I mean, you know, when we look at, well, why has this happened? We've looked at inflation in sentencing, but the other thing is the way in which prisoners sort of been used almost as a kind of make-weight for other public services. You know, and that's one of the tragedies of prison reform. You get certain bits of prison that get better, and the courts are reassured. So, you know, mental health treatment has improved marginally because it's been taken over by the NHS. So people think, well, that's okay, we'll get a psychiatric assessment there if someone's on remand, or we'll use prison for mental health care. The same is true of detox for people with serious drug addictions. You know, we know that 70 to 80% of people arriving in prison are testing positive for Class A drugs. Now, you know, again, the courts may be tempted.
It's an astronomical figure, isn't it?
It's huge.
Yeah.
So the courts might be tempted to think, OK, I've got a waiting list in the community for someone to go on a community drug treatment programme, and this is a borderline case, so let's use prison for a drug detox. second chance education. DFES has taken over prison education, improved the standards. So again, with young offenders, maybe some people are thinking what this young person needs is a bit of a lift on the education side. So we've got a sense of it stretching like some kind of capacious social service which is covering all sorts of people who actually should be dealt with in the community.
I mean, in my experience of dealing with the prison service and helping individual prisoners, you know, there have been some cases where prison staff and governors have been absolutely fantastic,
Yeah.
but there have been so many cases where, whether for malicious reasons or just because they're just totally overstretched, they cannot cope and cannot address the needs of prisoners.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, Prison Reform Trust runs an advice and information service which responds to about 4,500 prisoners a year, and that's partly, I think, why we feel that some confidence in feeling that we can talk about prison issues, because we're hearing every day from prisoners and their families and also often the lawyers representing them. And we get an absolute range from people who have been helped, yes, by individual staff, but very often things like disability, mental health, the failure to transfer people, and the kind of catch-22 of imprisonment. You know, the thing where in order to progress your sentence you have to complete a set of courses or programmes, or you have to be in a particular sort of prison. Completely impossible in an overcrowded, overstretched system. So people get held beyond tariff, people get moved before they can complete a programme, people can't present themselves adequately to the parole board. So the whole system, you know, you use the expression not fit for purpose, the whole system can just about cope as a warehouse arrangement, which the better staff, of course, don't want to be running that. They want to do something rather more useful for society. But it's fallen back on that kind of default warehouse setting, which is really disappointing and frankly, of course, dangerous in some instances.
Yeah, I found many cases where there are foreign prisoners who don't have good command of English.
Yes.
They've applied for English language classes and been told that no places are available, no funding's available. And of course, not having the capacity to articulate their feelings and needs, not being able to do that means they can't address psychiatric and health problems. You know, they can't get on the courses they want because English is a requirement. You know, they are caught in a catch-22 situation, which the Home Office doesn't seem to really be grappling with at all. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think it's fair to say that foreign national prisoners in general have a particularly raw deal, in fact. I mean, whether it's because there are language issues, whether it's to do with good access to legal aid or legal advice, whether it's about the fact that actually a very high number of the foreign national prisoners are serving disproportionately long terms for drug importation offences. And one of the things we'd like to see is to try to change the mindset so that we look at often the women who are in the main are the people doing these offences, acting as drug mules, but men too, that they often have been trafficked into committing a very serious offence. I mean, no one's quibbling about the offence. It is serious, clearly, to bring drugs into the country. But actually they're serving, you know, 10 to 15-year terms. They're very small people in the food chain of this rather grubby trade. You know, if you wanted to stop drugs coming in, simply catching these small people who are acting as drug mules is not going to do it. The sentence isn't a deterrent. Plenty of other desperate people around who'll do it. You know, and you talk to staff in places dealing with these sorts of people, and they say, well, they're not in any trouble, they're trying to earn a few quid, and it is a few quid, average wage in prison £8, to send home to their family, because that's why they did the offence in the first place. But actually we, the staff, find it hard to understand what they're doing here. You know, it feels to them a tragedy. And so often people, women and men in that situation, are just pleading for clemency. You visit a prison and they are literally begging, is there anything you can do? Is there anything you can do to have my case reviewed? And I think if these cases were reviewed, a very large number of them would actually merit some kind of clemency, some sort of pardon, and the opportunity to be transferred back home. You know, to say this is done, time enough.
I would also add that in my experience, you know, there are big question marks over the guilt of a lot of foreign prisoners. I'm sure many of them are genuine criminals and, you know, deserve the sentences that they get, or perhaps not quite as long, but, you know, broadly they deserve to be punished because they have committed crimes. But I also know of many cases where the evidence doesn't stack up to point to their guilt, and that's primarily down to the fact that they didn't have the English to communicate to their solicitors the evidence that pointed to their innocence. And of course, with the cuts in legal aid, solicitors nowadays don't have the time to prepare proper defences in criminal or asylum cases. So, by default, these people end up being convicted and put behind bars when, in fact, they are entirely innocent. And this seems to be an issue that the Home Office will not address, and they're jumping on this whole bandwagon of these nasty foreign criminals we want to deport, and not looking at the possibility that actually quite a few of them may be entirely innocent and have actually been convicted just because of the bad luck and misfortune that they couldn't speak proper English and communicate the facts of their case, which could have got them acquitted. Do you think that's fair?
Well, certainly one of the things that I think it probably is fair in some cases. I mean, there's certainly been a terrible failure of communication within what was then the Home Office, which was dealing with immigration on the one hand and prisons on the other, and the two bits of the bigger department weren't kind of communicating with each other, and hence this huge backlog of people held long over their tariff, which is, I mean, it's wrong. Simple as that, really. It's very wrong to hold people longer than they were sentenced in the first place. Of course it is. But now the Ministry of Justice has taken responsibility for prisons. I mean, I think we could reasonably expect a more considered, a more intelligent, I'd hope, approach than we've seen under the immediate past management in the Home Office, which has been dictated, as far as we can see, by popular headlines, by a kind of shouting approach to justice, really, which has just been a plethora of legislation, one new act after another, one new bill after another, often ill thought out, often don't connect well, and this effort to use this tough talking, this rhetoric on crime, which has really been the main driver for this vast increase in the prison population.
Well, if we can broadly agree that, inadequate English, for foreign nationals is part of the problem in terms of their conviction in the first place, their rehabilitation, their exiting from the prison system, because, if they haven't got proper English language skills, they can't complete the courses, therefore they can't get parole, they can't communicate properly to the parole board to justify their case. So that's one issue.
Yes.
Going back to your earlier points, you raised the issue of mental ill health and mental health problems.
Yes.
What are the statistics for the proportion of prisoners with mental health problems? I've heard the figure of 2/3 quoted.
The figures are so high. I mean, there was a very big psychiatric morbidity study completed, but which is now 10 years old and arguably needs to be done again. I mean, they're almost so high that it become meaningless. If you look at the assessment of young offenders, they said 90% of them had a diagnosable mental disorder, had at least 2 diagnosable disorders.
So we're dealing with people who are ill,
but
may have committed crimes, but crimes presumably exacerbated, by mental ill health.
Yes, if you used a public health lens and you looked at the prison population, you'd see a very sick population as opposed to a very inherently criminal population, I've no doubt. I think the figure that's more telling in terms of when you asked about how many is the 1 in 10 of the prison population who are suffering from some form of psychotic illness, so schizophrenia or other kinds of psychosis. Now, those people, I'm absolutely convinced, and I worked in mental health for 15 years before I went into work with prisons. I'm totally convinced that you couldn't choose a worse environment to make somebody more ill. The combination of isolation, uncertainty, broken relationships with staff, continuing movement, all those things, distance from home, lack of attachment, they're all the very things that really destabilise people. And if someone's ill, just holding on to that thread of sanity is very difficult indeed. So
what those people really need is medical treatment and care, family support and all those kind of things that all of us need to put them on the path of rehabilitation, not punitive, punishment in a very negative, hostile environment.
Well, that's right. I mean, and I mean, no point in being too simplistic about it. Clearly, there are some people who could be diverted pre-court, at police station stage or at court stage, into mental health care in the community and wouldn't represent a danger. And by improving their mental health, so we could reasonably look to a drop in reoffending. And there's been some very, very good research on that topic by Dr. David James. But if you look at other people who have committed or thought to have committed very serious offences, we'd be looking to maybe medium secure mental health care, or even secure in the very few cases, high secure, where it's absolutely necessary. So there needs to be a range of provision. But court diversion is absolutely woeful. It's really patchy right across the country. I'm going to add something else in, if I might, Peter, which is the number of people who've got learning disabilities or learning difficulties. We've just begun to kind of uncover that group that have previously been really completely neglected. And if you look at prevalence of people, often there's also an overlap, sometimes mental health, sometimes a kind of dual diagnosis with addictions, but People with learning disabilities, we've found some people who literally don't know what they've been sentenced for. They don't understand the regime. The staff are at their absolute wit's end to know what to do. And that is a human rights breach when it comes to the point that, you know, we've uncovered, for example, cases where people have said they've been told they've got to do a course in order to progress their sentence and in order to present themselves to the parole board, but they've been knocked off the course because their IQ's too low. Now, you can't have a two-tier system where someone who's got a learning disability actually has to serve longer in prison because of the nature of their disability. And I think sometimes you have to look to judicial review to really lever up change in a case of that kind.
Are there been any attempts to use the Disability Discrimination Act to challenge that kind of situation?
Well, I think it's a hugely important campaigning tool. I mean, we're looking to that more and more to say, you know, because of course the DDA covers such a wide range. It covers mental illness, as you know. It also covers learning disability, as well as the physical access. Because a lot of the calls to our advice and information service are about people with enduring poor health, chronic health problems or mental health problems. And they're literally stuck sometimes. I mean, absolutely literally stuck on a floor where they can't move. There may be not adequate wheelchair access. They may not be able to get to education or workshops or take part in the regime. I nearly said enjoy the regime. I don't think that's quite what I meant. But actually, you know, progress their sentence, use the time in any way constructively. So the Prison Service has said it wants to comply. Well, in fact, it has now to comply, but prior to the Act being brought in, the Prison Service already said it wanted to comply. But it is an incredible journey for it to travel, really, given it's very cash-strapped. You know, that it's got to provide access in old Victorian jails. You know, it's hard to imagine how that's going to be achieved. And then it's got to stretch properly to consider the people who are mentally ill and the people with learning disabilities and look at equality of opportunity. Very, very limited.
Now, I should hasten to add, you know, we're not soft on criminals.
Yeah.
You know, those who commit serious crimes need to be punished. They need to be, the community needs to be protected.
Yep.
But we also want to rehabilitate these people, to bring them back into society as useful, productive members who've served their time and can go on to lead law-abiding lives. And
Yep.
from what you're saying, really the prison service is not doing that. It's not preparing people to finish their sentence and go out to live a productive, useful, law-abiding life.
In many instances it's not, and in many instances it's not for want of trying. You know, it's a service that actually has a reforming zeal. You know, it's led by someone who wants it to be a decent, humane service, and most of the staff, there's a small minority of people who really shouldn't be anywhere near work with people, whether it's prisoners or anybody else. And that's very difficult because it really reduces the kind of professionalism of the whole service. But in the main, there's that drive to really make it productive, reforming service. But because of the overcrowding, because of the nature of cash, but perhaps most importantly of all, we haven't reserved prison as a place of last resort. You know, I've said it's stretched and stretched. We've had this inflation in sentencing and so forth. So what you've got now is a place that can't possibly meet all these different purposes. And in some ways, until we actually come to grips with what do we want to use prison for in this society, you know, and I think rehabilitation maybe has taken us off track a little bit. It should be there as a place of proportionate punishment. Somebody does something and it's this bad, and the court says that's what it merits, and they serve that term. Now, if it's a very short term, you could argue that why aren't they doing community service and supervised properly in the community? Do we really need to use jail for someone who's a very kind of petty offender? If it's to do with addictions driven by drugs or drink, why don't we try and address that and maybe use a health route to address that? You know, if it's for other sorts of vulnerability, but if it's a question of someone committing a really serious offence, as you said, they're going to have to be locked up. Now, if we reserve prison for the serious and violent offenders, which government says time and again it wants to do, but has totally failed to achieve, but if it did do that, then you could focus on, okay, how do we make this period of time productive, constructive? How from day one do we start talking about, let's plan your sentence, let's use this time, let's get you skilled up, let's get you to face up to what you've done, let's get some restorative justice in, let's see whether there's a way of making any kind of amends for what you've done. I mean, the capacity's there in the individuals and in the service itself, particularly if it works with other agencies, voluntary agencies, and with other services like health and education. But if you do all of that prior to reserving it as a last resort, in a way you confuse the whole issue, you know, and we start thinking of prison as an important place for making people better. By definition, it will always make people worse. And the staff, the best staff in the best prisons, when I go and see them, are always talking about actually how they're trying to bridge the gap about distance from home, trying to keep family support going, trying to get a bit of planning for, you know, for further training, employment, housing. They're trying to kind of break that, you know, thing that's already been broken many, many times before. They're trying to breach that gap and try and fix it and help people really plan ahead. But they're constantly being set back by the numbers, the level of uncertainty, the change. You referred to remand. You know, a fifth of the people on remand are acquitted altogether when they finally get to court.
Yeah, yeah.
So you do wonder, why did they all need to be in prison taking up those places?
Yeah, well, we know every year about 5,000 people convicted in the magistrates' court are subsequently, their convictions are overturned in Crown courts. And that's a staggering number, a staggering number.
It is.
Can I also address the issue of abuse within prisons? Because these are closed systems. And in my experience, you know, while there are, as I said, some very good staff, some very, you know, laudable staff, there are, as you say, some people working in the prison service who do not have respect for the people they're caring and who do harbour homophobic or racist or misogynistic views and often take them out on vulnerable, you know, prisoners. You know, I can think of one jail where, you know, a particular group of prison staff have labelled Muslim prisoners ipso facto as terrorists and terrorist sympathisers, and that's gone down their security reports. It's prevented some of them getting parole. You know, and these prisoners really have no redress because they complain, and the governor just repeats that it's in the security report and he can't divulge any more details because it's all a security matter. And so they're caught in this catch-22 situation. And when you complain to the prison and probation ombudsman, again, they seem to basically just take whatever the prison governor says, you know. And even I did a case at Norwich Prison where they found that, you know, a senior member of staff had made false allegations against a Muslim prisoner in connection with terrorism. He was exonerated by the Metropolitan Police. They said this was complete nonsense. And yet, you know, this was used against this prisoner. And, you know, it was only sheer persistence by the local MP, Dr. Ian Gibson, myself and a few others, that actually got the case resolved. So there doesn't seem to be proper mechanisms to redress abuses within prison.
Well, I think it's a really important point you're raising, and you would imagine there are so many checks and balances in our system. I mean, people come from all over the place, for Foreign Office delegations, British Council delegations, to look at our checks and balances, and they look at, you know, the role of the Chief Inspector, the role of the Ombudsman, the role of groups like the Prisoner Reform Trust, which operates independently but tries to be, you know, constructively critical. It looks at the independent monitoring boards who are appointed by the Home Secretary, I guess will be now appointed by the Lord Chancellor from now on, but the independent people that work inside prisons, looks at the complaint systems, adjudications, you know, there's layer on layer, and yet actually, just as you said, you know, case after case comes up where somehow, despite all that monitoring, all those kind of checks and balances, we somehow don't have enough. You only have to look at what happened at Wormwood Scrubs, when you know, a little jail operated within a big jail, and one where there literally was such abuse that, you know, even reading the files makes you feel quite sick, actually. Now, that's a rare event, but there was no public inquiry, despite huge attempts to get one. It took Zahid Mubarak's family an incredibly long time to gain an inquiry into his murder at Feltham. And the young man, I'm just trying to think of his name, Scholes, and his mother is called Yvonne Scholes. I'm just trying to think of his name. But he died in a young offender institution. He was a young man who had a huge track record of mental health problems and need, and because nowhere else could be found for him, he was put in a YOI and died very soon after. It wouldn't necessarily need to be, you know, an examination of what happened in that young offender institution. More importantly, it should have looked at sentencing practice, and it should have looked at options for the court in that instance. How come he ended up there? You know, there are those sort of prior questions. Even in the Zahid Mubarak case, sadly, the sentencing was ruled out of the ambit of the inquiry. So we never knew why a young man who'd committed actually quite petty offences ended up in Feltham in the first place, and that would have been a very important question to ask.
I mean, just very briefly, what key reforms would you say? We've only got about minutes, maybe. What key reforms would you want?
I'd want to see prison reserved as a place of absolute last resort, a proportionate place where people went and then used that time constructively, that the staff were well trained, well supervised, and were able to help someone progress their sentence. I'd like to see it joined up with a lot of important other public services, health and housing and other services of that kind. And just a rebalancing of a system that's been allowed to kind of grow in a crazy way, quite out of control. And if we want to point to something hopeful, maybe we should look to a new ministry, a Ministry of Justice, and actually ask it to act in a just way in regard to penal policy.
Okay, Juliet, thank you very much. I think you've got plenty of ideas there, and I just hope that the new Justice Minister, Jack Straw, will be meeting you soon and taking on board your very thoughtful considerations about how we might make prison work more effectively, both to protect society, but also to divert people away from the prison system so that those who have to go there get a place of security and safety where they can be helped to get back to a life of being a law-abiding, productive citizen, which is what I think we all want. Punishment alone is not going to solve the problem. Thank you, and thank all of you for joining us. Please be with me next week for another edition of Talking with Tatchell.